Hello. We're going to go over how to name amines according to the IUPAC system, and that there are actually two accepted ways to name an amine. Neither one is difficult. But first, we also need to review something, and the fact that there are different types of amines. And first of all, the amine is just a nitrogen that has anywhere from 1 to 3 R groups hanging off. Okay, so similar to the way that we've discussed alkyl halides and alcohols as being primary and secondary, we have the same issue here with the amines, where we have a primary amine, where it's a nitrogen that has 2 hydrogens and 1 carbon substituent, a secondary amine, where the nitrogen has 2 carbon substituents, and then a tertiary amine, which would have 3 carbon substituents hanging off of it. The two methods of naming amines, really, you can think of them as being called alkylamines, where we use the alkyl derivative with an amine ending, or alkanamines, where you name the alkane group, you drop the terminal E, and you replace it with amine. So let's work through some examples. Okay, so let's look at this example here. So what we want to do using the Alkylamine method is that you look at the total number of carbons, or the longest carbon chain that contains the amine. So we have here 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. So that would be a butane or a butyl group. And then we just add the amine ending. And finally, we need to give it the locant. So that way we know exactly where the nitrogen is. And so this would be 1-butylamine. So what happens if we have a secondary amine, like in this instance? Using the alkylamine method, we have to look to see if the two carbon-containing groups are identical or if they're different. And here we have 2 groups. They are both ethyl groups. And so it's quite simple. We would just name this one as diethylamine. Okay? What if, though, the 2 groups weren't identical? So let's add a 3rd carbon on one side. Whoops. And see how this changes. Now, one carbon group is larger than the other carbon group, so that becomes the root word. We still have the ending amine, but the root word now is going to be propyl, since it's 3. So this is a propylamine. And then we have this side, and we have to give it a name, and it would be ethyl, since it has 2 carbons. However, we do need to give the ethyl group a locant, and here the locant is N, since it's hanging off of the nitrogen. So this is N-ethyl propylamine. So now, let's go ahead and do the alkanamine method. This is where you would name it as an alkane. You drop that terminal E, and you add in the amine ending. Just like before, we have to look to see, this is a secondary amine, and so we have to look to see which side would get priority. And it's going to be the left side, because it has 1, 2, 3 carbons in the longest containing chain, whereas this one only has 1 carbon. Okay, so since it has 3 carbons, if it was an alkane, it would be called propane. However, what we do is we drop that terminal E and add the amine ending. So this is a propanamine. Now we have to name the other substituents that are hanging off. So we have a methyl group and a methyl group. So just like in the past, this would be dimethyl. And we have to give locants. I didn't leave myself much room to write here, but we have the locant of N, for the one hanging off of the nitrogen. And then we have the locant of 1, 2, of 2. So this is N2 dimethylpropanamine. So what happens if there are two amine groups hanging off of the same substituent? Hanging off the same compound. Well, once again, we want to look to see the longest carbon-containing chain. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that would be hexane. And just like when we had two alcohols, this becomes a di, and two alcohols were diols, this becomes a diamine. And we have to give locants. This is carbon 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is hexane 1, 4 diamine. Or you could also, it would be acceptable to say 1, 4 hexane diamine. Either way is perfectly acceptable in this instance. Now, if it's a benzene that has the amine hanging off of it, that has a special root word. That's called Annalynne. So, just like what we've seen with other benzene substituents, if we have something hanging off of that, then we can either use the letter locant for the position or the number position. And so here, this would be M fluoroaniline, since there are only two things hanging off. Or you could also say 3 fluoroaniline. So what happens if the nitrogen is not the only other functional group hanging off? Remember, nitrogen actually has a lower priority than anything that contains an oxygen. So here, the alcohol actually gets priority in the naming and in the numbering system. So let's count to see how many carbons we would have. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that would be heptane. Of course, we drop that terminal E, and this would become heptanol. We have to give the locant for the alcohol, and since alcohols take priority, this would have to be the lower of the numbering. Even though many times people would think, oh, they would want to start on what I have drawn as the right-hand side, where the amino group would get the carbon number 1 designation. However, the alcohol gets top priority, so this is 3, and now this becomes an amino group. Whenever it's the substituent hanging off, it's called an amino group instead of an amine, and this would be 7. So here we have 7-amino-3-heptanol. So let's try another example, one final example here. Give you a moment in order to name it yourself. So if you would like to, you should pause the video, attempt to name this compound, and then hit play again once to see if you were correct. So the parent compound would be a cyclohexane group. However, this ketone actually gets priority over the amino group. So therefore, this becomes cyclohexanone. And then we name the amino functional group, and we give it the locant. The locant would be 3, so this is 3-amino-cyclohexanone. Hopefully this helps you in naming the amines and wasn't too difficult.